welcome back. I'd like to move things along on the next part of the program. So next on our agenda tonight is a panel discussion of three professionals, academics and thespians. Each will be giving a short 10 to 15-minute opening statement on their views on untranslatability and the work of translating and adapting Shakespeare across cultures and languages. But before that, let me introduce the members of the panel. So first we have Dr. Jessica Chiba. She is an early career research fellow at the Shakespeare Institute, whose research on Shakespeare focuses on philosophical issues raised by Shakespeare's works, especially ontological and epistemological questions about existence and knowledge. Combined with her work with Japanese translations of Shakespeare, her work explores the intersections of textual Shakespeare studies, global Shakespeare, and philosophy. She is currently working on editing her first book, Shakespeare's Ontology, and also working on a project called Shakespeare's Untranslatability. Joining her is Mr. Ronan Capinding, another professional who can truly attest to this double business of Shakespeare academia and performance. Not only has he acted in several roles, such as Romeo, Macbeth, Hamlet, and Shylock, but he has also translated a number of Shakespeare's plays, including Measure for Measure and Taming of the Shrew. As you may have seen in the videos posted, or one of the videos at least posted in the UPDECL page, he's also the go-to guy for anything Shakespeare and teenagers, having been commissioned to write Betta's William, a rap musical about young students studying the Bard. Currently, he teaches with the Ateneo's Fine Arts Department. Finally, in the panel, we also have Mr. Guelan Luarca, a published and award-winning playwright, actor, and director. He too currently teaches with the Ateneo's Fine Arts Department and is himself an artist involved with Shakespeare in multiple aspects, as translator, as director, and as dramaturg. Notably, he has translated Arellano, which was staged in 2019, and adapted R&J into #R Heartbreak Sign J in 2015 and Ang Katatawanan ng Kalituhan in 2016 by Dulaang UP, two adaptations of Shakespeare's works that, in Guelan's hands, have effectively been reinvented into completely new plays. Now, to help facilitate the conversation, we also have Miss Alexandra May Cardoso, an instructor with the DECL, where she also earned her degree in creative writing. She is also a playwright whose work, Ang Sugilanon ng Kabiguan ni Epifania, was first staged at Virgin Lab Fest 13 and has since been staged by several theater groups, including Mint Teatro. Her academic interests include dramaturgy, multilingualism in theatrical scripts, translation, and adaptation in theater. So May, you have the mic.
All right, thank you so much, Nikki, for that wonderful introduction and for a wonderful overview of who is in our panel this evening or in this morning for those of you watching from Britain. And unlike the past few panels that we've had, this is going to be semi-presentational but semi-conversational as well. So what's going to happen is I'm going to ask each of the esteemed panelists to give us a short preliminary statement on their process of translation, and hopefully that can be our jumping off point for the conversation/open forum that will occupy the rest of the session. So first, I would like to hear from Dr. Jessica Chiba regarding her process of translation and untranslatability and what she has to say regarding these ideas. So Dr. Jessica Chiba, you may begin.
Hello. My name is Jessica Chiba, and I'm very delighted to be at this fun and exciting webinar. Thank you ever so much to Judy for the invitation. So our topic today, as you've already heard, is translation, or rather untranslatability, translation, and adaptation. And I've been given about 15 minutes, but I have no intention of monologuing for those full 15 minutes. So we'll see how long I can go before I get tired of myself. Now, I'm not a professional translator. I have translated in the past, but my study is in translation. And my own interest is very much in the area of untranslatability. In fact, my specific study is what you can discover about Shakespeare based on what you can't translate. And since I can only work in Japanese and English to any degree of expertise, I'm really looking forward to hearing what my distinguished fellow panelists might be able to tell me about what they found untranslatable. But then you have to understand translation before you can really talk about untranslatability. So a lot of my talk is going to be about translation. First, though, I'd like to see how my pursuits intersect with Judy's interest in the double business of theatre and academic study. As far as double business goes, I tend to sit quite far on the side of academics because any ambition I may have had in the theatrical direction ended for me when I was a teenager, and the world sighed a sigh of relief. But as an academic, my interest has always been in crossing boundaries, and sometimes in showing that what might look like a boundary isn't a boundary at all, but a construct, an arbitrary cutoff point that puts things into smaller units that are easier to think about. So as far as I'm concerned, the gap between theatre and academic studies is one of these arbitrary gaps. I rather like how this webinar has taken that phrase, double business, because theatre and academics can be a double business. It's a single business, but doubled in some ways. And there's something similar to the experience of being mixed race like I am, where the feeling isn't that one is half one nationality and half the other, in spite of the way that we tend to phrase being half something or the other. Rather, I think if you're a mixed race, you're both completely one nationality and completely another. And in that sense, to be in a double business is not to be half and half, but always doubled. After all, both academic and theatre practitioners start at the same point with Shakespeare. We read the play. And maybe before reading the play, we were introduced to it at a performance given by somebody else who read the play. And maybe we know that reading the play itself is a process that's mediated by editors and a whole tradition of editing Shakespeare, as we just heard about. But the act of interpretation begins with this unstable entity that is still recognizably a play. And whether one edits it, writes an essay about it, acts in it, or directs it, all those activities are an interpretation and an engagement with the play. So in a very real sense, these activities blend into one another. An actor doesn't need to have asked an academic about the play to have engaged in academic activity, since the edition that she uses was probably the result of someone's hard academic study. And so, as it stands in the modern day, the play on stage is no more the real play than the play as handled by academics. And to continue to pit the two spheres against one another is really to hide the fact that there aren't two distinct spheres at all. And you're probably wondering by now what all of this has to do with translation. But it does, because if one is staging the play in a different language and in a different culture, one still begins with the text, but it's a text that's already been interpreted by somebody else, a translator. And here we have another form of mediation that is not completely academic and not completely performative, though it is both of those things, combining the desk work of an academic with the practical work of performing a translation. And I use that word performing for good reasons, I think. A translation is a performance and an interpretation. And though it might seem like we have here a pretty concrete boundary, the boundary between two languages, insofar as the translation of Shakespeare can continue to be called and recognized as Shakespeare, that boundary appears to be permeable. So perhaps in bridging academics and translation and theatre, we are to triple business bound. So I'm going to think a little bit now about the extent to which language separates worlds and how translatable Shakespeare is. One of the difficulties of being an academic working on Shakespeare and translation is that it's a surprisingly understudied field. In translation studies, Shakespeare is often used as a case study because his work is some of the most translated pieces of literature in the world. But in Shakespeare studies, ideas around translation are quite confused. And that's partly because the word translation can be used in all sorts of different ways, such as the translation from page to stage or the translation of Shakespeare to screen. In other words, it tends to be used synonymously with the word adaptation. So the subject is very rarely focused on what we would call interlingual translation, the translation between languages. Luckily for performance scholars, when interlingual translation is discussed, it's normally in the context of performance analysis, and I'll come back to that. I suppose the main reason for this lack of translation studies in Shakespeare studies is that many Anglophone Shakespeare scholars are monolingual, and even if they're not, insofar as Shakespeare is written in an older dialect of the same language that they already speak, it does seem like a bit of a long way around to study his work through another language or even in another language. But for many people around the world, studying Shakespeare in translation is not just a necessity, but a reality. And so by overlooking translation, we ignore a significant part of the experience of Shakespeare around the world. After all, only about 13% of the world population speaks English, and less than 5% of those people are native speakers. If we even consider how many of those native speakers can understand early modern English, our experience of Shakespeare in the original tongue is quite limited. As Michael said yesterday, things like the use of surtitles on non-Anglophone productions that show the lines in early modern English have a way of effacing the differences that translation makes in the receiving culture, in the culture in which this production was created. So though I stand by my comment that the boundary between languages is permeable, I do actually think that the boundary is much harder to traverse than, say, that between academics and the theatre. While there might be a desire for somebody from a non-Anglophone background to learn English and to try and understand Shakespeare in his original language, there seems very little reason for an Anglophone scholar to understand Shakespeare in another tongue. A theatre practitioner can benefit more materially and more obviously from academic knowledge, and an academic can benefit from theatre in a material way much more obviously. The general perception in translation, though, is that people from a non-Anglophone background will need to study the original, but Anglophone scholars do not need to study translations, except perhaps as a curiosity. So the power dynamic is quite unequal. Thankfully, in performance studies and in the study of adaptations, this has changed in quite obvious ways over the last few decades, with non-Anglophone directors like Ninagawa, Suzuki, Onken Sen, or Vishal Bhardwaj gaining considerable notice and popularity. And although studies of such non-Anglophone productions and films tend to focus on visual aspects, it has occasionally encompassed questions of language as well. So we're making some progress. And I think that we can think about some practical ways in which to overcome some of the problems that we have in the lack of focus in translation studies. One way of thinking about translation in Shakespeare is in relation to specific performances, where the translation itself may have led to particular performance choices, or indeed where language choices were made by a translator for that performance. In fact, many translations are made for specific performances. And this method is useful because it can illuminate aspects of that performance that are not purely visual. Another way of studying translation, which is done quite often, is to look at the work of particular translators in particular countries and to analyze the stylistic choices that they've made. And this approach is quite interesting. It can reveal things about the target culture. And It's worth noting that most translations are written in the language of its time, so a translation can disclose a lot about what that target culture was like at the time that the translation was made. So this can become a bit of a historical study. The question is, though, how such translation studies might feed back into our worldwide circuit of understanding about Shakespeare and become part of the rhizomatic structure of Shakespeare studies rather than a tiny branch at the end of our tree of knowledge. Learning about the target culture through translations in that kind of historical way can be fascinating, but it is also easily dismissed by academics and textual studies people as irrelevant for Shakespeare studies, except as a question of regional interest, because it doesn't shed much light back on Shakespeare's text itself. Studying translation in relation to performance is a little bit more obviously useful because it can reveal performance choices that may not be apparent to an Anglophone academic or a director. And the third approach, which is my one, is to look at Shakespeare through translation, and particularly the aspects that can't be translated, to see what it might reveal about the text itself and the culture in which it was produced. And I think that's quite a useful way of destabilizing one's notions of Shakespeare and what Shakespeare means, to see his work through the lens of a different culture and a different language. But you might say, is any of this translation stuff unique to Shakespeare? Could you not say the same of Ben Jonson or Sheridan or Wilde or Beckett? Surely what I've said applies to translation generally. And of course, you'd be right to make that criticism. But just to end my talk, I'd like to suggest that there is something about Shakespeare that is untranslatable. Untranslatable even if we take a broader definition of the term to include translations to stage performance or translation into scholarly explanations. It's far from revolutionary of me to point out that Shakespeare is Shakespeare because of the layers of meaning in his work. And academics and practitioners alike know that any interpretation can only take a few of those meanings at one time. A stage production has to decide what to emphasize, just as an academic essay must focus on a few aspects at the expense of others. It's the potential for these different ways of playing the same play and the variety of different readings of a single play that keeps performers and academics coming back to the text. Whatever anyone chooses to do with a play, something of it remains unassimilated, untranslated. Otherwise, we would have, say, a definitive production or a definitive reading of, say, Macbeth that solves the play, as it were. And the same might be said of translation. Shakespeare's plays are translated over and over again into the same language sometimes, and not just because times have changed and the translations need updating into a modern language. Sometimes several translators are translating the same play within years of one another. And it's because something remains untranslatable, because there are always new ways of rendering the same line, the same metaphor, the same pun, that Shakespeare attracts such attention. And surely we are all engaged with Shakespeare's works, not in spite of his untranslatability, but because of his untranslatability. And in that sense, we are all bound in the same business. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chiba. That was very insightful, and I was really surprised to hear that Shakespeare in translation is a relatively understudied field. So maybe that's something that can be unpacked further when we invite our two other panelists to talk about their experience with translating Shakespeare into Filipino. And I also want to highlight what was said about how translation can take so many different aspects, especially like performance-specific translations, and also the idea of translation being an artifact of a specific audience or a specific reader in a specific time. So thank you for that. And I'm sure we'll be able to expand more on those ideas later on. But before that, I would like to invite Ron Capinding to give us his statement on his translation work for Shakespeare and the concept of untranslatability. So Ron, take it away.
Yeah. Good evening and good morning to our friends in the UK. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for that glorious introduction a while ago, but I teach part-time in the Fine Arts Department. And my full-time teaching load is in basic education. I teach the Filipino language in the junior high school. I will share with you today my personal process and philosophy in translating English pieces to the Filipino language. Personal process and philosophy, which I developed more fully when I translated Shakespeare's works. And I intend to do this by telling you about my journey. My first meaningful encounter with a Shakespearean piece happened when I was a freshman in Ateneo de Manila College. And that was through the Filipino translation of A Midsummer Night's Dream by national artist for theater and literature, Rolando Estino. I joined the theater group Tangalang Ateneo, and Midsummer Night's Dream happened to be their production in Filipino. So Shakespeare in Filipino. That was the first time I appreciated the literary genius of Shakespeare. Coming from the province of Tarlac, I was insecure with my English and I avoided speaking or writing in English or even reading certain English texts as much as possible. Back then, I only knew Shakespeare as a renowned, prolific English playwright who authored Romeo and Juliet, which I haven't read then. Before college, Shakespeare was something I avoided because it was challenging and alienating, if not unnecessary, and because it was that kind of English. But I was very good in the Filipino language because of Tarlac's Ilocano, Bicolano, Pampangueño, and Pangalato languages. And because of my rich Filipino vocabulary, I could distinguish between conversational and academic and formal and lyrical Filipino. And so when I encountered Rolando Tino's translation of A Midsummer Night's Dream, I witnessed and experienced a very skillful use of Filipino. It was a Filipino that is, like Shakespeare, initially complex in structure, but upon being unlocked, actually rolls off the tongue and surprisingly is both very coherent and lyrically impactful. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, where there were royalties and lovers and players and out-of-this-world fairies, I found in Tino's translation that terrific harmony of a wide range of Filipino usage. I was so impressed with how Filipino is effectively stretched in that translation. And that led me to admire the original source, Shakespearean language. So that was my first meaningful appreciation of Shakespeare when I experienced Tino's Shakespearean Filipino. So I'll start my presentation now. And I became very interested in, and eventually did, Filipino translations with Tino as inspiration. I compared his translations with those of other Filipino translators, and what distinguished him is his pursuit to capture and to be faithful to classical literature's classicalness in his Filipino translations. He was trying to match the English audience's experience of Shakespearean language with the Filipino audience's experience of his Filipino translation. This, I believe, is what Dr. Jessica Chiba refers to as transparency. I watched one of her lectures in YouTube. Transparency, wherein the translator is invisible in his effort to provide a Shakespearean experience by his or her translation. I believe transparency is what distinguishes translation from adaptation. And I observed that Rolando Tino, with his background in literature and philosophy and theater, was always trying to be transparent in his translation while other translators were doing adaptations, or what Dr. Onofre Pagsanghan calls transplantation, which is a movement or transfer of something to another place or situation. But in Tino's translations, Scotland is still Scotland, and a Jew is still a Jew, and a nightingale is still a nightingale. And each famous Shakespearean line, thought, and idiom can be found in his translation in Filipino language. He was translating the experience of a Shakespearean language. Let me repeat that. Translating the experience of Shakespearean language. I like Tino's way, and I've been using his way as my standard. For example, this is Ronald Tino's translation. This is a part of Hamlet. But how my cousin Hamlet and my son, notice that Hamlet's line here is a little more than kin and less than kind. There's an alliteration of kin and kind. And let's just proceed with that. And let's see how Rolando Tino tries to match not just the meaning, but the literariness or the figure of speech or the artistry of how it's expressed. So for Filipino viewers, you will understand that ngayon, pamangkin at anak na Hamlet, he uses kamag-isip here as something he just coined. We don't usually do that, but using the prefix kamag actually indicates a very clear meaning, which is similar in mind, kamag-isip. But that is his way of trying to echo or mirror the kin-kind expression, and so on and so forth. Let's notice this next line. And that's so, my Lord, I am too much in the sun. Rolando Tino chose lagi ako nasa araw, meaning the sun, just the sun. But what's very comforting about Rolando Tino, and I have his book, and I have another book on Macbeth. At the back of his book, he actually admits the limitation of his translation. But that comforts me, because if he notices those things, that means that everything else that is not here, he was able to capture. So he says that nasa araw, I'm too much in the sun. His translation is not able to capture the pun in sun and sun. But if you look further in 129, namumuong laman, he translated solid as namumuong laman, but he recognizes that sometimes it's solid or solid. And in which case, if you choose that, he proposes or he suggests that you use the manchahang laman instead of namumuong laman. So that is what comforts me about Rolando Tino. He is aware of what he is letting go and what he is trying to capture. Also, in the next slide, his way helps those adept in the Filipino language understand Shakespeare more completely. And by more completely, I'm distinguishing Tino's translation from adaptations, which sometimes only borrow the plot or characters of Shakespeare's plays, but not capturing the quality of his language, which for me is the greatest feature of Shakespeare's pieces. And so I started translating some plays, not yet Shakespeare, in the way Tino did. I think this was what helped me improve my English, because I needed to read those literary pieces and grasp those classical plays and capture their meaning. I've always tried to translate transparently and completely, despite the request of the director or the person commissioning me to translate. I never at once edited out or transplanted any part of the original to suit a director's adaptation. I believe I had to present first to the director, or to myself if I'm the director, Shakespeare in Filipino in its fullness and its faithfulness to the English before any adaptation begins. Even when I was the director of what I was translating, I never translated the original piece according to my intended adaptation, but always according to the source. I just could not. I couldn't multitask and do translation and adaptation at the same time. Or perhaps because I didn't want to miss out on something great that the source featured, be it an imagery or a beautiful statement or a figure of speech. I remember translating something I would direct, Shakespeare's Measure for Measure. I think it's in the slide. And the play was obviously long, and I was sure I was going to shorten it. And I also wanted to make it more modern by putting pop music and modern dances to distinguish between the government of the Duke and of Angelo. Despite all these assumptions, I still translated the play completely and transparently, putting aside my intention to shorten and modernize it. I wanted to do a translation first and then adaptation afterwards. When I finished the translation, that's when I started truncating parts to shorten it. But then I became more aware of what lines in my translation are key to the audience's understanding of the play. And I realized I did not need to modernize the Shakespearean Filipino. I realized such effect can be achieved by comfortable delivery and incorporating modern inflections and tones without changing words of the Shakespearean Filipino. I must say that I usually prefer to be around as translator when directors and actors make decisions about my script. I need to point out sensibilities that they may have missed before they decide to cut or change the lines. Like in the original English, the Filipino translation would need intelligent readers, intelligent actors. And so as translator, I try as much as I can to collaborate in the development of the production, particularly in the understanding of the script of my translation. I'm also a theater actor and director, and so in my translations, I can already sense if my lines roll off the tongue and are stimulating to an actor, and what certain dramatic or comic effect could be achieved by the director. I only fully understood the challenges of translating Shakespeare when I translated Shakespeare's plays. And I found out that translating Shakespeare takes much longer, usually triple the time of other plays with the same length. And I mean translate, not adapt. It's harder to translate Shakespeare. There is serious reverence to the meaning of the original. It would have been easier to adapt Shakespeare at once and skip and escape the process of transparent translation. I'll explain why. In a Shakespearean play, there's just too many elements to mirror or to translate to the Filipino language. And it would really help if the translator has mastery of the translation language, which is Filipino, the source language, which is Shakespearean English, not just English, audience reception, humanities, literature, philosophy, culture, and history, languages, etc. And by etc., I mean everything else, including the arts, performing arts, visual arts, film, or even martial arts and culinary arts, and sciences, and different experiences, and films, and technically everything under the sun that could give a translator greater capability to capture and translate more completely and perhaps more accurately Shakespearean texts. Before Shakespeare, I translated the experience of a classical text by capturing the essential meaning of the line and articulate it with the equivalent Filipino words. But in Shakespeare, you also have to translate his artistry, lyricism, figures of speech, and strangely, you just cannot drop the literal meaning of his idioms because he uses the literal meaning and essential meaning simultaneously in his verses, usually in his play on words. I'll use an example. This is not Shakespeare, but for the idiom, eat your heart out, if you are to translate this, in Shakespeare, you will have to consider the essential meaning, then the artistry, and then again, go back to the literal meaning. Why? Because I can translate eat your heart out, maybe it's a common expression in English. The most common thing we have in Filipino, maybe not accurate, but at least it echoes the commonness, the ordinariness of it is mamatay ka sa inggit, die of envy. But then again, considering Shakespeare's artistry, the pun or metaphor of eating is usually sustained in the dialogue. And sometimes it means the essential meaning and sometimes the literal meaning. So I find myself needing to translate and incorporate the literal meaning in my original mamatay ka sa inggit, die of envy. But because the literal meaning of eat your heart out is kainin mo ang puso mo palabas. It doesn't make sense to Filipinos. Kainin mo ang puso mo palabas. So what happens now here is you decide as a translator to give the experience of Shakespearean language, not necessarily the translation of the experience of Shakespearean language. And so I choose something less popular, but still rolls off the tongue. Maglaway ka sa inggit. It's very similar to mamatay ka sa inggit, which actually means drool in envy. Maglaway or drool allows me to go back to that theme of eating and mouth, supposing he goes back to that in his next dialogues. And this is an example, the taming of the shrew. You see a word here saying wasp. And then Catherine says waspish here, referring to wasp in the previous line of Petruchio. But waspish actually means the tendency to be always angry, which is actually also echoing angry here. So for a Filipino translator, how do you try to match or even indicate this creativity, this artistry? And then you go on and you find out that there's a very funny exchange of lines and it's very witty. And then who knows not where a wasp does, where his sting in his tail, and then tail is again repeated here as tails, yours if you talk of tails, and so farewell. What with my tongue in your tail, and that's funny. And so as a Filipino translator, you understand what is a wasp. You can translate it as kulisap or potakte or himbubuyog, and you choose the most applicable word to allow you to capture a similar experience. And so I decided to choose potakte, and then I will use the word potak to actually also echo that not angry quality, but the nagging, annoying quality. So it's not accurate, but what you're trying to be accurate with is the experience of the Shakespearean language where it plays with words. I also can choose between buntot, which is the translation of tail, but it's not funny when Petruchio ends with buntot, dila ko sa buntot. It's not an image that we find funny. So I chose to translate his tails to puwetan, which is the behind, and so on. And so the translation has become like this. It's so crowded. I'm very sorry. Halina, halina, putakting suplada, tunay nga, nangangagat ka na. Mag-ingat sa putakte at kay bagsik ng kanyang putak. Ang solusyon kung gayon, pitasin ko ang pangkagat. Asa nga, kung kaya yung mahanap ng ungas. Mayroon bang di alam kung nasa ng pangkagat ng putakte? Sa puwetan nito, sa dila nito, sa dila nino. Sa dila mo, kung pulos puwet ang nasa bibig. Kaya paalam na, ano, kung ang dila ko nasa puwet mo? So it becomes, it's trying to capture the experience of the language. That is my way. Other people would translate it differently, but that is my way of capturing, putting together the essential, the artistic, the literal, and all these elements. And then also in Measure for Measure, I usually translate the names of the characters, but I realized that in one of the scenes, there is a punchline about Mistress Overdone's name. In the latter part, Pompey says, Mistress Overdone. Your mistress name, Mistress Overdone. Had she had any more than one husband? 9, sir, overdone by the last. And so even if I just echo the Scalus Escalo, Pompey becomes Pompe, I translated Mistress Overdone, literally, overdone is like laspag. So, ang ngalan na yung senyora, Senyora Laspag. Nagkaroon ba siya na higit sa isang asawa? Siyam Ginoo, laspag na siya, no ikasyam na. So, it becomes so to achieve that humor and that, so that is how I try to bring together the essential, artistic, and literal. And so it takes so long to translate a Shakespearean play because you actually weigh all these considerations and come up with a decision. And so that is my take on untranslatability. I think untranslatability is the opinion of the reader reading the translation. You see, the reader is important in the process of translation. He has to have as much, if not more, knowledge and experience to grasp the translation. For me as translator, pardon me, Miss Jessica, everything is translatable. Translating is just a matter of articulating what I comprehended. And I can definitely articulate in Filipino everything and anything I was able to comprehend. Unless it is my comprehension, that is one thing. One can always translate what he understood, translatable, regardless of the richness of his or her understanding. The issue, therefore, is not untranslatability, but more of ungraspability. I invented that word. Or what Jessica calls unthinkability. So, hindi mo naintindihan eh. It's unthinkable, so you weren't able to translate it. There's the rub. How equipped is a translator? A translator, therefore, should never-endingly improve his aptitude for comprehending and articulating. And hopefully the reader does the same. Because this reader is usually the director, the designer, and or actor. And they are the ones who serve Shakespeare and the transparent translation to audiences. This concept of unthinkability is, I believe, the greater concern or ungraspability. And this is where academic and artistic merges, I think. And the translator will further hope that both reader and the audience have the aptitude that he has, or at least the ability to acquire the tools as they are experiencing his translation. And when the director or reader tries to make an adaptation of Shakespeare using one's translation, the adaptation prevails over the translation. And adaptations are usually a conveying of one's own new vision or message and or catering to the audience's taste, which are all fine and worthwhile. But hopefully, the adaptation should still also facilitate in understanding and appreciating Shakespeare. And since this webinar series is about Shakespeare as academic and artistic practice, I'd say that translation, reading a translation, acting a translation, and making one's own translation is that one stone that hits those two birds, the artistic practice bird and the academic practice bird. So for example, in this line, Parte Shot Sweet Sorrow, I've asked my high school students who knew Romeo and Juliet to translate this in Filipino, in my Filipino class. And they were saying, I know what that means, sir. It's uh, malungkot, matamis na malungkot ang maghiwalay. Yes, but look at the English version. It's alliteration. Alliterative, such sweet sorrow is such sweet sorrow. Rolando Tino translated it in his play as kay tamis ng hapis, na hapis ng paglisan. Whoa, all my students say, whoa. And then they started to come up with their own. They were inspired by Tino. They copied some of the lines. One student said, kay tamis na hapis ng pag-alis. Naks. There's a rhyme to it, and it's actually trying to echo the artistry. Then the other one is kay tamis na lumbay ng paghihiwalay. And so on and so forth. And so when I also told them about I asked them to translate. I haven't translated this. The first line of Richard III, now is the winter of our discontent. And they were having a hard time translating it because there's winter and there's discontent. And at home, I tried to do it myself. And it was so hard. It took me a lot of time. So I came up with, ngayon, pinakananunuot ang tagpuot. At least that prefix of tag indicates some season. Tag-araw, tag-init. And when you say winter, it's like the peak of this contest. But that is so difficult, that first line. That's why I never translated fully Richard III. This will be a very bumpy and long ride. But when I proceeded with the next line of continuing that first line, I realized that the whole statement is a happy statement. And it's because may glorious summer by this son of York. But naman, how can I proceed with this? And so I tried to translate it, and this is what I came up with without having to think about it too long. It becomes ngayong pinakananunot ang tagpuot, nagningning ang tag-araw na sinikat ng York. Yung sinikat, I would change it to sinilang. If this sun here is a pun, I don't know, a pun of son bilang anak. So all those things. And after emulating a standard, the translator eventually begins to make his own choices in translation and develop his own brand and style with the pursuit of transparency as still the constant element. So the Taming of the Shrew, when I translated this, I saw Orlando Tino's translation of Taming of the Shrew. He did not translate it. He just needed to translate all the 36 titles of Shakespeare. And that was his translation. Ang pagpapaamo sa perka. For me, it was a little bit too snobbish and alienating. Shrew is not as alienating as perka is. So I decided to, sorry Tino, you're my idol, but I have to choose ang pagpapaamo sa Maldita to provide some familiarity to a very, very alienating title already. And when I did measure for measure, a lot of people are translating the title as sukat sa sukat, or Rolando Tino did not translate this, translated batas sa batas. But when you read it, it's all about measure means disciplinary measures or safety measures. And so patakaran sa patakaran, and I ended up with hakbang sakbang, and I'm comfortable with that because that is how I captured the whole thing. So as I was saying, the academic practice and artistic practice are the two birds hit by this one stone that is translation, or doing and dealing with translation. Besides acting or staging or deciding or designing, this is actually hitting those two birds. Translation can be conveniently implemented in the classroom in short sessions. Translation, especially if it's a transparent one, and if by someone immersed in a wealth of knowledge, enhances one's comprehension and appreciation of Shakespeare the way Tino's translation did to me when I was a freshman. You become more aware of and more attentive to Shakespeare's artistry. On the other hand, it celebrates the power of the Filipino language in capturing different thoughts and styles and qualities of another language. Translating stretches Filipino language to articulate unfamiliar expressions and tones and styles of delivery. Translation allows a mutualism between the promotion of Shakespeare and the promotion of the Filipino language. And the ultimate pursuit of educators, which is to form their students into lifelong learners, is achieved in this process because a student translator realizes that grabbing every opportunity to learn would give a translator greater capability to capture and translate more fully and more accurately the great value in great books like Shakespearean plays. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Ron, for that very enriching talk. And I love the way that you demonstrated these very unique linguistic choices that lead to a very sonic and also very artistic rendering of Shakespeare in Filipino. And I also like how much of your experience as a translator was really informed by your own linguistic identity and your own experience of Shakespearean English when it was translated into Shakespearean Filipino. So it's a really fascinating process, a very fascinating experience as well. And to round out this panel, our final panelist is another translator of Shakespearean works into Filipino. It's Guelan Luarca. Guelan, take it away.
Thank you, May. Thank you, Sir Ron, and thank you, Dr. Chiba. I loved what Sir Ron shared because actually it covers of around 50% of what I was planning to share. So that will help me truncate my sharing. And I'm gonna time myself 10 minutes. I don't want to take up so much time. All right, so I'm gonna share screen. So you see, it's funny. Sir Ron started his discussion with Rolando Tino's wonderful, super intelligent, clever translation of that difficult line, kin and kind. And it's funny, Sir Ron and I weren't able to discuss beforehand, but I'm starting on the same point too. And I suppose that is testament to how Rolando Tino is inescapable. And I'd like to give a personal note that if Sir Ron learned this craft of translation from Tino, I learned it from reading Tino and from Sir Ron himself, who was my teacher in translation. So anyway, let me proceed to my presentation where I kind of enjoyed pretending that I have this formal paper. Yeah. So there. So I will title this short talk on more than kin, less than kind. So same spot. We'll start on the same spot as Sir Ron did on the untranslatability of Filipino Shakespeare. And the italic there is important. I'll point it out. The picture here on the left side is a puto. It's a picture of a puto, which is a Filipino rice cake, and then a Western-looking typical delicious cake, and that will be relevant, I hope, later on. So as I said, I'll be starting off where Sir Ron did. Act 1, Scene 2 of Hamlet, a little more than kin and less than kind. Let's try to do a quick comparative study of the different translations. So this is Spanish. Algo más que deudo y menos que amigo. I did a back translation to see how to approximate a word per word translation of the meaning of the Spanish. So it translates something like something more than a relative and less than a friend. In French, translated by Victor Hugo. I didn't know that Victor Hugo translated Shakespeare. I will not attempt to read the French. The back translation reads something like a little more than a cousin, a little less than a son. So comparing the Spanish and the French, we can already see here how this specific passage in Hamlet is extra tricky, extra naughty for translation, for translators because of the pun in kin and kind. And if we were in the original, Shakespearean pronunciation, kind would most probably have been read as or pronounced as kind. So there. When we turn to a German translation, the back translation reads, rather not be so close friends and loved less. A little more, of course, I'm only relying on Google Translate, okay? Because I do not read German, but so I'm not sure if the German speakers in the audience can confirm if this is a good back translation, but you can already see some distance from the original. But anyway, we turn to Filipino, and you've already seen this in Sir Ron's presentation. It goes, higit ngang kamag-anak, hindi ko man kamag-isip. And as Sir Ron pointed out, that beautiful rendering of kamag-isip, I tried to back translate it. Of course, I can't rely on Google Translate on my own, and I really can't find a way to look for the English equivalent of the term kamag-isip. Okay, so it's more than a relative. Kamag-anak is a relative, but less than kamag-isip, I cannot find a proper English translation. The reason being, kamag-isip, as Sir Ron has already explained, is a coinage, a portmanteau, a Tino invention, using kamag from kamag-anak, attaching it to isip, meaning thought. So kamag-isip can roughly translate perhaps to someone of the same mind, someone of the same, I don't know, idea or persuasion or attitude. But this has always boggled me as a reader, as a fan of Rolando Tino, and as a student translator myself when I was younger. And this boggled me. How is this possible? How is Rolando Tino able to kind of come up with such a beautiful, enriching translation of Shakespeare that not only rivals or equals the original, but actually adds on to the local experience of this Filipino rendering? I found that Filipino translations, not only of Tino's, but also of Mr. Capinding's, Nicolas Pichay, Rodi Vera, and all the Bienvenido Lumbera, and all the other translators in Filipino, I find that in Filipino translation, there's more dynamic equivalence. And here I'm borrowing from technical terms in translation studies. There's more dynamic equivalence, meaning equivalence in meaning, and less informal equivalence, meaning equivalence in word per word or language to language or grammar to grammar. It is also, in Filipino translation, it is also more paraphrastic, more paraphrasing, rather than metaphrastic, meaning a word per word rendering. As opposed to, for example, in the Spanish, yes, it is not a word per word rendering, but you see that the equivalences used by the translators kind of fall to the same grammatical categories, to the same lexical definitions, etc., etc. But in Filipino, kind is not kamag-isip. But in Tino's translation, it makes total sense. So why is Filipino translation this way? Why is it more dynamic, and why is it more paraphrastic as opposed to formal and metaphrastic? I do not know the technical answer because I'm not a linguist, but my practice tells me that most probably, apart from discounting the poetic ability and genius of the translator, so Rolando Tino is not only a translator but a poet himself, but also this dynamism and this paraphrastic nature of Filipino translation comes from the fact that Filipino in English belong to different language families. Filipino is Malayo-Polynesian, while English, Spanish, French, and German are Indo-European. Therefore, when texts transfer from English to Spanish, French, and German to other Indo-European languages, the translation becomes more transparent, more legible in each other's horizon of languages, horizon of reality. Whereas in Filipino, the Filipino translation almost can stand on its own, precisely because the relationship between languages are distant. And what happens here is Shakespeare in Western languages being more transparent, in Filipino it's more opaque. The translation behaves like an original. Kamag-isip is so much more original than kind. In this way, Shakespeare lives a double life. Shakespeare lives a double life in Filipino. There are two Shakespeares that any Philippine audience can learn to fall in love with and appreciate and marvel at. The Shakespeare who wrote in his time and place and language, and the Shakespeare who seems to transcend time and place and is infected by Filipino culture, a Filipino worlding of sorts. Okay? And so Shakespeare becomes richer in the lack of fidelity. Okay? Filipino translation is so culturally rooted and is rich replete with local associations that it almost automatically renders any translation into almost an original. And I want to use this specific case. In Twelfth Night, translated by Rolando Tino, the line by Toby Belch, dost thou think, because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale. Tino renders it as, sa akala mo ba, dahil ubod ka ng bute, mawawala sa mundo ang puto at serbesa? You see, in the original English, when a Filipino hears it, most probably the image that is conjured in their heads would be the same as the image that is conjured in the head of a Western listener. Okay, they will imagine the picture on the left, cake. But to us Filipinos, when we hear puto at cerveza, we suddenly see a Western created character with a Western name, Toby Belch, suddenly talking about a reality that is so close to home. It is so homey. Okay, now we are able to imagine a Shakespeare who has puto for breakfast, who knows the distinct smell and flavor of the rice cake called bibingka, for example, every Christmas season. And that makes Twelfth Night, the play, even more festive, reminding us of the roots of the play in Christmas time. Another example, this time translated by national artist Bienvenido Lombera. In Lear, in the famous scene where he's raging against the winds, he says, "All Germans spill at once that make ungrateful man." A contemporary audience would most probably, use context clues to understand the Germans actually means seed, sperm, etc. But in the Filipino Bienvenido Lombera, he renders it as such. Isabog ang lahat ng tamod na lumilika ng mga taong walang utang na loob. Tamod here, to Filipinos, we would know that this word would make us shudder in polite society. Tamod is actually our word for sperm, but in context, it is heard usually in boys' locker rooms, in drunken talk, etc. And so the effect of seeing this high tragic character shouting, this guttural, dirty Filipino word tamod creates this clashing, dissonant, but ultimately powerful and beautiful and passionate moment. Okay? What am I driving at? The unique thing about Filipinos is we can ask ourselves, why do we translate? And our motivations are hardly out of necessity because we are bilingual. A lot of people who would even think of watching a Shakespearean production, whether in English or Filipino, most probably would be able to understand the original English. But precisely, we choose to translate and read and watch translations out of an aesthetic and hedonistic purpose. We want to enjoy the difference. We are fluent in English. We do not need a Filipino translation to understand Shakespeare. But for some reason, when Shakespeare is rendered in Filipino, we see not only one Shakespeare, but many Shakespeares, at the least two, coexisting. The Shakespeare who is canonical, white, dead, and wonderful and great, universal, etc. Harold Bloom says he invented the human. I don't know what he meant by that. But also we see the Shakespeare who, like us, eats puto. Like us, uses the dirty word tamod in his poetry. Okay? Because we enjoy it, we revel in the difference. And so I want to point our attention to the possibility, okay, that perhaps more than the untranslatability of original to target language, it's also of note to unpack the untranslatability of that translation. Because back translating Filipino translations, like what Sir Ron showed us with his Taming of the Shrew and his A Measure for Measure and his attempt at Richard III, when you back translate Filipino to English, a lot of it is lost in translation. Okay, And back translation will always fall short. The Western world is part of our horizon of the real, of experience as past colonies. But our world, our local world, our Filipino world is not yet part of the West's horizon. Therefore, it's quite unfortunate that they are not experiencing a doubleness, a doubling, a multiplicity, a plurality of Shakespeares that we get to when we hear and enjoy translations. Shakespeare in translation from West to West seems to be for preservation. Okay, it reminds me of Goethe's world literature. But Shakespeare in translation from West to East has this uncanny ability to perhaps decolonize, to indigenize, to reclaim, to transform, and to subvert. Okay, so the same, I'll just read this. The same can be said for all translations, but perhaps it is especially clear in translations from West to East, and especially clear to us Filipino translators, that translation can transcend purposes of preservation, canonization, and fidelity in order to become opportune moments of indigenization, reclamation, transformation, subversion, and even counter-colonization. In Filipino Shakespeare, not just Shakespeare in Filipino, but Filipino Shakespeare, the Shakespeare that has become Filipino with puto and tamodin, etc., Shakespeareana is potentially de-imperialized. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Guelan, for that wonderful talk. And I really want to highlight what you said about although we don't necessarily need a Filipino translation of Shakespeare, it's more really of an artistic, to enhance the artistic and hedonistic, in your words, experience of Shakespeare. And drawing from my own personal experience of watching Shakespeare translated into Filipino, it was not so much the words themselves rather, but like the sound of the words, the way that they would come out when they were being performed. So I do appreciate that point, and also this really interesting idea of how the translation functions as an original work itself, and the untranslatability of the translation. And I would like, at this point, I would like to bring in all of our speakers in the panel, because we only have 15 minutes left for the open forum. It's okay, it's fine. It was a really fascinating, very enriching conversation amongst all three of the panelists. And I would highly encourage those in the Zoom room to submit their questions via the Q&A function. And for those who are watching us on Facebook, feel free to add your own questions via the comment threads. And while we're waiting for some more questions, I would like to ask, because I'm very familiar with how Filipino audiences receive or react to Filipino translations, because when I was in undergrad, my hobby was, with my friends, I would watch, if ever there's a staging of Shakespeare that's both in English and Filipino, I would watch both the English and the Filipino. And the feedback or the consensus that I hear from my friends and from other audience members is that even though they appreciate the English because of the sound of the words and all of that, they found it easier to connect and be more entertained by the Filipino translation. So I know for just drawing off of that, just a bit of a parallel for that, I would like to ask Dr. Jessica Chiba if she's ever encountered a native Japanese speaker responding to their translations of Shakespeare, and what you might have to say about that.
Thank you. That's quite a difficult question, actually, because we don't have the same kind of history in Japan of colonization as in the Philippines. So I think that the sort of power that you gain from translating when you don't need to translate is not there in Japanese. And the other thing is that, unlike in the Philippines, where most people are bilingual, Japanese people are mostly unable to access Shakespeare in the original language. So in that sense, they don't really see the translations as translations in some ways. They take it as the text itself. And they have no means of distinguishing in between these two things. So if they're responding to the translation, it's hard for them to tell whether they're responding to the translation or to the text. And I think in that sense, unless they're scholars who have looked at different translations or they're responding to specific differences in between different translators, it doesn't happen very often.
Oh, thank you. That's a really interesting difference that we see in like the reception of like native speakers to these different translations, and how it's really indicative of like not just the linguistic roots, but also the cultural and even colonial roots of these cultures that we are translating into. So in the interest of making this open for everyone, I would like to start reading some of the questions that we received. This question is specifically addressed to Sir Ron Capinding and to Guelan. How often have you considered, if you have, that is, subverting the rules of standard Filipino in order to arrive at a translation that satisfies you? Either one of you can answer.
Maybe I can answer. By experience, it usually happens with Shakespearean comedies. We notice it's more apparent in Shakespearean comedies how Shakespeare actually uses like a polyvocality, like a big difference in diction, from formal to informal to gutter speak to, you know. So I found in my experience, and I hope Dr. Alex Cortez will remember since he directed it, and Sir Ron also, he directed when I was in high school, my translation of Comedy of Errors. But I was more confident when I redid it a few years back. I employed language that would actually fail the standards of poetic Filipino. I cannot recall the specific now, but in the end, going back to the 3-tier checklist of Sir Ron, sometimes the artistry, oftentimes I think the artistry will have to be king, and therefore say that, okay, you will now be forced to achieve the same comic effect. You'll be forced to kind of shed off those strictures and those linguistic conventions and employ a word that otherwise would, you know, would be out of context just for the comic effect. So I find that it often happens, and I revel when I get the excuse to do that in translating comedy. There.
I resonate completely what Guelan said, but what I want to clarify, when I do translations, I actually try to offer the experience of the Shakespearean language. I'm not really translating words. I'm trying to create it the way I experienced it, as authentically or as faithfully or as honestly. Maybe that's the term, because authentic is not within my expertise. As honestly as I could. I experienced this with this line, and then so sometimes I take those liberties to change the words just to achieve that cadence, that wit, that punchline. So yeah, but the standard is, yes, Guelan is right. It's the artistry that actually prevails later on, because that is the impressive part of the whole language experience.
Yeah, I do think that as translators, we need, especially when we're translating for the sake of artistry and aesthetics, we really should be brave enough to take these liberties of like breaking the rules of language. And that's something that I myself, as a translator, I'm still trying to learn, because I'm still very like, what is the proper way to say this or say that, which is, I'm learning more and more, not a fruitful way of approaching translation. So thank you. This question is for Dr. Jessica Chiba. And this is similar to the question that I have after listening to Guelan and Sir Ron talking about their approaches to translating and keeping the cadence. Do the Japanese translations try to retain the pentameter or the sonic quality of the original Shakespearean text, seeing that there can be vast differences between the syllabications of Japanese and English?
Yeah, so that is one of the major issues in translating into Japanese, because Japanese is not a stressed-based language. So it doesn't really make sense to say that there are stressed and unstressed syllables. Having said that, some people have tried, and actually I was talking to Dr. Shoichiro Kawai of Tokyo University quite recently. He's been translating quite a lot recently, and he's especially interested in those prosodic or yes, there's metric stresses and things, and he's actually succeeded in doing it on some parts of Shakespeare's verse in Japanese and trying to keep a rhyme as well. But I think that that's the kind of thing that you'd have to be told was there for you to read it. A Japanese person wouldn't automatically look for the stresses in the language. So, and the other question is whether that actually translates to a poetic sensibility that Japanese people understand. It might replicate the Western ways of poetry, but given that that kind of poetry doesn't exist in Japanese, just because you replicate it on stage, does that mean that the audience will get the same kind of feeling as a Westerner would? And if you look at early Japanese translations from, say, the late 20th, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, sometimes they translate into Japanese poetic meter, so into 5 and 7 syllable lines and that sort of thing. But that kind of experimentation is less done lately. It becomes more realist.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see how Shakespeare gets translated, not just in the Japanese language, but just also following Japanese poetic meter, poetic standards. And I would really like to see that, because so far, what I've seen, whenever I've seen Shakespeare being performed in Japanese, it's not just a translation, but it's more of an adaptation of Shakespeare from the Western theater form into the Japanese theater forms like No and the like. So really interesting, and I would really hope that I would gain some more experience and exposure to that, because it seems to be a really fascinating field of translation to explore. This question is addressed to everyone, and this was also something that I wanted to unpack as well. I just wondered what the thoughts are on translation versus adaptation, as in when translating texts between languages, there may not be an exact replication of the texts, but it's not exactly an adaptation, and how you might approach that. And I think I'd like to bring in my own question into this question as well. How can we make a clear distinction between translation and adaptation when there are so many cultural nuances that bleed into the language, which requires a certain degree of adaptation as well, and not just a word for word kind of translation? Anyone can answer. Yes, sir, Ron.
I will borrow one concept I got from Jessica, which is transparency. In my presentation, I mentioned that I think that is what distinguishes translation from adaptation. A translator tries as much as he can to mirror, to be transparent, to reflect the source. Philosophically, you might say we are bound by our time and our limitation. Where you say there's the language of the time, and there's also the understanding of the time. So for me, I don't feel guilty about that. It's still myself, like anthropocentrically. I'm the center, I'm the subjectivity that looks at these two things. I'm like the apex of the letter V, and the other two ends are the English or Shakespeare's language, and then the Philippine language, and I'm trying to match the two based on my aptitude. And I say aptitude because right now I also check my translations, and I see I need to make this more upbeat. So it's always like that. So it's also an understanding of the time. But what I can I think there's a distinction, transparency. I also do adaptations. And as I said in my presentation, I try to translate everything first. Just translate as faithful as I can to the original source. And before I try to play with it. So transparency, I think, is the key word. And I thank Miss Jessica for providing that term.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and
think actually I was going to add to that, if you don't mind. That is largely a question of terminology, isn't it, about adaptation and translation? And there is a distinction between the two, but as I said myself, they tend to be used interchangeably at times. And I think that Ron, you're probably right that what distinguishes translation from adaptation is this sense of indebtedness, or something that you have to stay true to. And adaptation is always feeling a lot freer to change things. So I suppose if we're going to say that some stage productions are translations onto the stage rather than adaptations onto the stage, then in that sense, we can probably use the word translation, not just linguistically, but in a kind of semiotic way as well.
Yeah, so perhaps we can apply something that Dr. Chiba said in her presentation, that all of these labels, including the terms translation and adaptation, are just arbitrary constructs, if you will, and really just the practice of translating and adaptation, despite the fact that our logical minds will try to make distinctions between the two, they often intersect and they really manifest in their own ways. One last question, I guess. Some students may already be familiar with Shakespeare and his works and may be holding these in high regard. And I think they're talking like Shakespeare in English. How can we convince them that translated Shakespearean works are also worth delving into?
I think, if I may briefly answer, I think it's the most natural thing. It will just magically, it just happens, I think. Of course, there's this assumption that, oh no, deep Filipino, and in context of the Philippines, most of our students are afraid of Filipino, poetic Filipino, etc., etc. But in my experience, both as a student and when I started teaching Shakespeare, and one of those teachers who insist on teaching Shakespeare bilingually, I found that yes, at first it's going to be a hurdle, it's going to be a scary climb, but after the first two sessions, they naturally just gravitate and fall in love with the Filipino. I don't have the scientific linguistic answer for it. Maybe it's sorcery, but it happens. I hope Miss Jessica and Sir Ron can unpack further, but for me it's complete magic.
I also have a very pragmatic answer to that. Just show them good models of translation. Show models that really match it and sometimes surpass the original. And that's possible. Sometimes you just are so lucky that you are able to use this word that actually moves or touches more versus the one they had in English, even if they appreciated it that much. Maybe that's it. Just show good models. And I think it's also the duty of translators to really enrich themselves to be able to capture and articulate these beauties from classical texts from Shakespeare.
Yeah, I think that probably Ron and Guelan are completely right about that. That if you are already bilingual, then it doesn't take very much for you to become interested in the translated texts. But if your students aren't bilingual, that's a bit harder to convince them that it might be useful to look at other texts. And there are some Anglophone scholars who have ended up studying translated texts, so it's not impossible. But I think the key thing here is not just about translation, but probably if you're teaching Shakespeare, it'd be quite useful to remove that reverence for Shakespeare from your students, because it's really limiting in all sorts of ways, and it's not just about translation. So show them some radical adaptations. That would be my cure for that particular malady.
Yeah, I agree with everything that everybody has said, and I would like to add in like my own personal insight to this, that truly my appreciation for Shakespeare grew even more when in addition to the original text, I also encountered these reinterpretations, these translations, seeing them on stage, hearing them, reading about them. It's just really I think the ultimate goal of translation really is to make Shakespeare not just accessible, but something that can be appreciated from a linguistic and artistic perspective. Yeah, and I do think despite
and I think
yes,
and I think also to celebrate your own language, as
yeah,
I mentioned,
absolutely.
the mutualism of that process. Yeah.
It kind of reflects an idea about Shakespeare that has been reiterated many times during these past few days, that Shakespeare is really about plurality and not singularity, that there is no such thing as an unstageable Shakespeare text, and to that effect, there's no such thing as an untranslatable Shakespeare text. And as much as this topic is rich for discussion, I'm afraid we're short on time. So I will have to end it on that. Thank you so much, Dr. Jessica Chiba, Guelan, and Sir Ron Capinding for this very insightful talk. And I hope that everybody else got something from it, because I certainly did.